Hi, this is Corey Johnston, and today's lesson is going to take place in the 26th chapter in the book of Matthew. Treachery is afoot, and there is a plot and a conspiracy to betray and execute the Messiah. And in between the two parties of the conspiracy, the high priest and then Judas, the willing complicit partner, who is one of the 12, he is anointed at Bethany, and this has a lot of, this is common to Mark and John, the anointing ceremony. But in the previous chapter, the 25th chapter, we read of three parables, the final one of which is the first two of which are kingdom parables. They are referenced to as the kingdom of parables of the kingdom nature. They all open indicating that, but the third and final one, which is unique, as is the first to Matthew's account, is a parable of the ultimate and final judgment. And he addresses it in verse 31. And when the Son of Man comes in his esteem, and all these sacred angels with him, then he shall sit at the throne of his esteem, and all the nations shall be gathered before him, and he shall separate them one from another, as a shepherd separates his sheep from the goats. So every person alive, every person who has ever lived is going to be there. All the nations, there's an indefinite extension by the three-letter word all, and they're going to be gathered to be judged, and the judgment is going to consist of a separation, those who are hellbound and those who are heaven-bound. And the heaven-bound are likened to the sheep, and the goats are the ones who are destined for hell. And there's a variety of hypotheses. One, he is our good shepherd, and the sheep know and respond to his voice. The Christian, as to have the docile mentality of a sheep to his shepherd, we have to listen for and respond to his voice, whereas the goat is a more rambunctious and far more difficult animal to domesticate and control. Sheep are prone to wander. We are naturally wayward creatures. It's part of the human nature in as much as the sheep, but goat is an altogether different animal. And, he's going to tell those that he saved, that they inherited it, they made it, they're in the kingdom, they're good for life forever. And he says, you did all these good deeds to me, and they're confused because he's referring to, first off, he's speaking to disciples present and future. So when do we give food to him when he is hungry? And the answer is that in the least among us is a accurate reflection of who he is. How we treat the least among his chosen children is the mark and measure according to which he measures how we treat him. He enters into our pains and our struggles and experiences. What did he say to Paul when he converted him on the road to Damascus? Why do you persecute me? Paul thought he was persecuting the followers of the way, but he was in fact. But the 40th verse, and the king shall answer and say to them, truly I say to you, insofar as you did it to one of the least of my brothers, you did it to me. So the righteous, the sheep, the saved, whatever you want to call them, they're not aware of doing so. The reason we do our good deeds is not out of any expectation of reward. We are not, placing God in our debt. We are doing them because we are in his debt. It is the logical extension of grace to do good works, and it's as a fruit of our salvation, not the finalizer thereof. But we should, have no mentality or expectation for reward, yet we can have faith that we will be rewarded in the end, and that our master is the all-seeing, all-knowing eye in the sky, and the discernment makes the difference between the sheep who are saved and the goats who are damned. He shall then say to those on the left hand, go away from me, accursed ones, into the everlasting fire prepared for the devil and his angels. So you follow Satan, you succumb to his snares, you succumb to his destiny, and you are doomed. And the devil wants to take as many people down, and the Satan fell because he wanted to change one word in the Lord's Prayer. He wanted to be able to say mine instead of thine. And when we trace back human rebellion, the same selfish motive emerges, the desire to say mine instead of thine. So the goats, the unsaved, the damned, are selfish by nature. They don't care for the hungry. They don't care for the sick. They don't visit people in prison. They are bigoted and prejudicial towards strangers and everything else, and they're going to ask the same question that the righteous answered. When were you there? What are you talking about? We never saw you before. But how, the Creator lives in his creation, so he exists in other people. We are all endowed with the image, and as such, how we treat the least among us is in fact an accurate measure, according to which the greatest among us, the high one, the Almighty, the Most High, that he recognizes that is his mentality. Then he shall answer them, saying, Truly I say to you, insofar as you did not do it to one of the least of these, you did not do it to me. So he gives them the same answer. They just neglected. They were selfish, self-oriented, Satan-following creatures. The sin of selfishness is instilled by Satan, and if you succumb to his snares, then you will surely meet his same end. And these shall go away into everlasting punishment, but the righteous into everlasting life. Read the word everlasting twice. Once is in reference to punishment. That is not desirable. That is not a place you want to be. And then everlasting life, that's something we want. That's something we're all offer after. That's something that can be attained the right way. But there are no shortcuts to Christianity. And we're going to open with the 26th chapter. Remember, treachery is afoot, and the Son of Man is aware of it. And it came to be, when Yahshua ended all these words, he said to his disciples, so he had a pretty busy schedule, beginning in the 21st chapter when he enters into Jerusalem. He tells some parables. Then in the 22nd chapter, he dismantles these theological controversies of the Herodians, the Pharisees, Sadducees. Just everyone's trying to trap him in the temple, and he outsmarts them and outfoxes them without fail every single time. They're playing checkers, he's playing chess. Then he pronounces 7 woes on the Pharisees in the 23rd. Then he gives his Olivet Discourse, the end of times. Then in the Matthews, he tells 3 more parables after giving the end time discourse to his living disciples, which is valid and applicable for us. But he had a busy week, and he's telling his disciples at the end of that. So what I want you to take away from the summary is that the Pharisee, the chief priest, the ruling religious establishment, has him in their midst, and they're determined to get him because he had done all these things. He swept out the temple violently, also in the 21st chapter. Probably should have said that part. You know that after 2 days the Passover takes place, and the Son of Man is to be delivered up to be crucified. So he knows what's going to happen, and he knows when's it's going to happen, and he knows why it has to happen. We do catch in the same chapter his flesh groaning and struggling to accept the cup of medicine that he asked the Father to let it pass from me. Nevertheless, not as I will, but thy be done. So that was 2 days away, the Passover. He was the typological fulfillment. He is the Paschal Lamb, the sacrificial lamb. He is the Passover, and this he's just the fulfillment of what the Christians celebrate as Easter chronologically occurs with the Jewish Passover, because that's when he Passover and procured our redemption. And he was going to be crucified, because that is the way that the Romans, that was their method of capital punishment, and this was not the ordinary means of capital punishments. This was reserved for traitors of the state. So what the Jews have to come up with is some violation according to which they can get the Romans to care, because the Romans could care less about their theological disputes, debates, and controversies. But that was the method, and the Jews were so seething in their hatred, that they would rather see him hung on a cross than stoned according to the laws of Moses. Then the chief priests and the scribes and the elders of the people came together at the court of the high priest, who was called Caiaphas. So of the 3 people that are mentioned at the chief priest's place, the chief priest is the first one. He is known as Caiaphas. He held the office from 18 to 36. He was the son-in-law of Annas, who held the office from 6 to 15, but he's in charge and in control. Although the Romans appointed him as such, a lot of the Jewish people still considered Annas their high priest because they considered it a lifetime appointment. But since the age of the Gentiles, especially during the Hellenistic period, the office of high priest had been reduced to political bargaining and maneuvering the high priesthood. But the scribes are there and the elders are there, and Caiaphas is the name of the high priest at the moment, and plotted to seize Yahshua by trickery and kill. So they are conspiring to kill him, and, he's just evaded every trap. This is nothing new. This is the culmination of their ceaseless efforts, that began 3 years ago when this man, minister, this itinerant preacher who came and threatened the status quo and just the establishment, who resorted to trickery because they could not trap him. They could not prove him as a breaker of law. He was the master of every situation, and they had him at the edge of cliffs, and his time had not come yet. They had rocks that they had picked up in determination to stone him, and he just vanished away. So all this time he had evaded their conspiracy to kill him, and now their best brains, their top minds, are gathering together for an illicit scheme, which is a conspiracy. But they said, "Not at the festival, lest there be an uproar among the people." The potential for riots was clear and present. Passover was a season during which time the Roman occupiers would have been nervous because of the potential for riots, because this is one of the 3 holidays that the Jews were commanded to gather as one from the diaspora back to Jerusalem to celebrate in unison. So the more people there, the more potential for mob mentalities and riots. And what the ruling establishment ultimately does is turn the mob against him, because everywhere he goes, he always has the crowd in his corner. So they get the mob, and that's what they do. But they don't want to, do it when it would be improprietous from their standage point of being the custodians at the behest of Roman masters, because they wanted to do it, if they did it too soon, it was still all a matter of timing. It is 2 days away, and that's when it's going to take place, and it's not now because, it's going to be a city run amok, out of control, and they don't want that. And when Yahshua was in Bethany, in the house of Simon the leper, Simon the leper was no longer a leper. He wouldn't have been in human society if he remained a leper. So he must have been healed by the healing touch of the compassionate healer. And Bethany was a town some 6 miles away from Jerusalem. I think it was near the Mount of Olives or something to that effect. But it's the same place so he's not quite in Jerusalem, but he's near it and outside it. So he's not in Jerusalem at all times throughout the week. One time he cast a curse on a fig tree when he was in a somewhat similar location to this. But at the house, a woman came to him, having an alabaster flask of costly perfume, and she poured it on his hand and head as he sat at the table. This woman is identified as Mary Magdalene in John 12:4. Here it's just a woman, but we know with greater specificity that it was her. This was the first witness to the resurrection. She was a devoted female disciple whose love and loyalty, adoration, and affection were unrivaled. And Yahshua never had an enemy who was a woman. He was always and only their friends, and Mary Magdalene was the best of his friends. And an alabaster container would have been ceramic, so it would have been expensive in itself, but costly perfumes. From other accounts, I've read credible estimations that the amount of spikenard of expensive oil that she poured on his feet would have been equivalent to 3 years' wages for a worker. So it wasn't an understatement when I said it was costly. And she poured she's pouring it on his head, his hair, and sitting at the table. And of course, who is around but the disciples, who take notice and protest at his at the seemingly extravagant waste of resources, which they feel could have been allocated to alleviate poverty. And when his disciples saw it, they were much displeased, saying, "To what purpose is this waste? First off, anything we give to him is never wasted. It is a investment with dividends. There is no waste, no giving." And this was an act and a memorial which would survive as a witness to all the ages and all the nations whenever the good news was proclaimed. But they're thinking of money, and his disciples, this is plural in this account, but in John's account, it is Judas, the one who protests this. And we read a few things about him there, that he was the thief. He was a thief. He had the bag of funds. And this plays into our personal hypothesis, of which we're going to explain as to why Judas did what he did when we get there. But for the sake of this account, it is the disciples plural, and they're the ones protesting what they see as an unresourceful waste of expenditures. For this perfume could have been sold for much and given to the poor. It could, we just described how expensive it was. You could have fed a lot of homeless people and maybe even housed a few for a while with what was just poured on his head, just this one-time event. But it is an anointing, and the anointing was already an official fact. He was anointed to be the Messiah. The Messiah translates as anointed, and this was planned and set in motion before the foundation of the earth, and everything is unfolding. History is marching in its inexorable progression to the greatest stage in redemptive history when he accomplished it. However, when Yahshua noticed it, he said to them, "Why do you trouble the woman? For she has done a good work towards me." So he doesn't protest or complain that, this woman poured out her lavish love, and she was wiping his feet with his hair in other translations. And Paul writes that a woman's hair is her glory in 1 Corinthians 11:5. So she was devoting all her glory to him. So she had the ministry of adoration and could just not get enough of this man. That's Mary Magdalene. So he's clearly in his corner and against the disciples, the consensus as are expressed in the collective. So that what we find out in the answer is that they are missing the mark. They are missing the meaning. They don't know what they're talking about. They are speaking in ignorance. However, when Yahshua noticed it, he said to them, "Why do you trouble the woman? For you always have the poor with you, but me you do not have always." He's raising awareness in the hopes of stimulating an appreciation for exactly how little time he has left. He's about to eat his last meal. That's the next event we read after Judas sets in motion the wheels of his official betrayal. Read of the Last Supper in verses 17 through 30. We're not going to get that far today, but the point is that his time was short and their hour was now. So, the poor people are never going to go away. And, one of the simplistic solutions to the pain and suffering of the world is just getting poor people to stop procreating. But that's you can never do that because, when your life is that miserable, sex is just one of the only things you have to enjoy. So, you cannot, use eugenics or social engineering to design poor people to cease procreating. For in pouring this perfume on my body, she did it for my burial. Again, he's raising an awareness for the significance that he was going to be dead in 2 days' time. He is 2 days away from death, and he is being anointed officially in the flesh as the providential arrangement. We already explained that his anointing was preordained from the foundation of the earth, but now it has become official in time as humanly understood. So she did a great thing, and truly I say to you, whatever this good news is proclaimed in all the world that this woman has done shall be spoken of also to her remembrance. So her testimony is going to be vindicated from here on out, all across the world, all across the ages, by generations and nations of believers who hear the good news, who read the New Testament and the Gospels and just everything else. They're going to know this woman's good deed is going to be sealed and marked in history as a witness of an outstanding deed. The lavishness of the love that she displayed was nothing short of extraordinary, and it is a remarkable model that we have to aspire toward. Then one of the 12, called Judas from Iscariot, went to the high priest. One of the 12, Judas, was in the church, but not of the church. He had intimate access and proximity to the Master himself. He had heard every sermon. He had witnessed every miracle, yet he did not believe. And Judas is the human equivalent of Lucifer, who is the arch betrayer of Yahweh. Judas enjoys the dubious distinction of being the most reviled figure in all of Christianity, just the arch traitor. And the question as to why he did it, and this is ultimately speculative, but, I think that he had different ideas and plans for who the Messiah was going to be. He stubbornly clung to the Jewish expectation that was then in currency, which the Messiah clearly invalidated through the meaning of his ministry, which was to liberate the Jewish people from their Roman oppressors. And this man who was preaching meekness and doing miracles without killing Romans just had it all wrong. And he had the executive ability. He was entrusted to distribute the funds and to keep them. And we learned that he was a thief from that. So he was knowledgeable in the ways of the world, and he probably thought himself superior to the apostles and ultimately the Master himself, because the Master was not wise in the ways of the world. Judas was. And he just shows the trap of worldly thinking. It compelled him to something. So he agrees to betray him, and we read the amount in the next verse. But before the man he betrayed is even killed, he kills himself. And said, "What would you give me to deliver him to you?" And they counted out to him 30 pieces of silver. So he wants to know for what is your price. He's willing to do it. He's here for that reason. To betray him, I have the access. I am the key which can unlock the door that the robber can enter in and destroy and kill the owner of the home. And the amount, 30 pieces of silver, would have been the equivalent of 120 denarii. Denarii would have been the standard day's wage for laborers in the ancient first century. It's also so it was also the going rate and the price of a slave. So it was no small sum of money, but just the covetousness and the greed is truly disgusting and despicable and revulsive, especially in reference to the Master. But you know what? He loved him the whole time. He broke bread with the man. He washed his feet. And for he showed hospitality, and he did not betray his identity, because if he did, Peter, the rash and impulsive one, might have killed him. So he knew what he was doing, but he did not stop loving Judas. But love is, God and the Son also love the hellbound. They love all the world, but that love does not save. The fact that he still loves everything that he's created and intimately invested does not mean that he will save them. And from then on, he was seeking an occasion to deliver him up. So he accepted the money, and now it was time for him to earn his end of the bargain. He had to go out there and do what he had already been paid to do, to betray him. And then, so what we read after this is the Last Supper. This is the Passover meal, and we read of the ordinance of what has variety of names among the respective denominations. Catholics call it communion, Baptists call it Lord's Supper, Mormons call it sacrament, a lot of Protestants call it Eucharist, but it's all the same thing. It's all the same memorial meal. This is where we pass out the bread and the grape juice or wine. And then he's in the Garden of Gethsemane praying the bitter prayer of the cup that he had to drink. His flesh he was a human, just, and his flesh resisted the notion of crucifying himself and being mocked on and spit on and belittled. But it is in the Garden of Gethsemane where Judas shows up with temple guards, club-carrying, sword-wielding temple guards, to betray the Son of Man and earn the unenviable epithet of the Son of Perdition. That's all the time we have for today. Thank you so much. I'm so glad you're here. Stay tuned until next time. I'll see you then. Bye-bye.